Let's go. Okay, we're going to let people start coming in. And while that's happening, I'm making it so that everybody can talk with each other and everyone can see each other's questions. So we're just going to start letting people get there, and I'm going to open the chat so that people should be able to talk to each other. As people are coming in, we would love to know where you're watching from and who you're with. If you're with a certain organization or an affiliation, we'd love to hear where you're watching from. Welcome to today's webinar from Hyperspace Challenge. My name is Meredith Schweitzer. I am one of the communications support folks for Hyperspace Challenge. We have a couple of short announcements, and then I'm going to hand it over to Sandra for the panel today, which is a really exciting panel. I'm so grateful to all of you for participating. I think this is going to be a great conversation. Just a couple of quick announcements. If you're as part of the Hyperspace Challenge community, we have two really exciting events coming up. As you know, we do these webinars about once a month. Next month for November, we're doing a little Hyperspace Challenge Friendsgiving. It'll have one-on-one networking with colleagues and peers and folks from the industry across the startup kind of ecosystem. So we would love for you to join us for that. I believe that Annie might have a link to put in the chat for that. And if she's not putting the link in the chat, it'll also be included in some email outreach. And since you registered for today's webinar or you're watching this after the fact from an email, you should get that information as well. There's also an event in December to mark your calendars for December 6th at Q Station in Albuquerque, New Mexico. If you're located in the Southwest or you feel like taking a little trip out here, we would love to host you at the Hyperspace Challenge event on December 6th. That is really just a celebration of the community. Annie, if she knows the name of that particular event, can plug it in the chat. And again, you'll get more information on that as we get a little closer. Okay, let's get into the program today. And Megan, I see your hand is raised. So if you have a question, you can throw it in the chat, and hopefully Annie can help us answer it for you. So we have a great panel today, and I really have to thank Brian Holt from Exotrail. We are so grateful to you for coming to Hyperspace Challenge with kind of the idea of the panel, and the work that you all are doing is really fascinating. And I think that a lot of the companies, whether you're US-based or you're a global company and you're looking to really take advantage of the US ecosystem, this kind of conversation of how to make it work and where the challenges are, I really credit Brian for bringing that to us as an idea. So
Well, I don't want to take all the credit. Sandra wrote the article a year ago, so but thank you, thank you.
Well, okay, there you go. So it was inspired by Sandra, really. Our other panelists, Jack Shelton is a partner with Aegis Space Law, so he'll be kind of being the on tap here to talk to us about regulatory issues and legal issues. Charlie Jacka is with SpaceWorks, and she is going to give her background, which is very extensive, over 20 plus years within the industry. And Nate, oh God, Nate, I'm going to ruin it. Nate Giacomo, did I do it right?
Boom, got it.
Nate is the head of HEO USA, and I think that he's going to have some really great insights on that kind of global dynamic. So we're so grateful to all of you for being here. And if you don't know Sandra Erwin, you're living under a rock. So we're so grateful to Sandra for taking some time out of your busy schedule to talk with this group today and share your insights. As Brian was mentioning, this group was really inspired by an article you wrote last year about the complicated nature of this kind of dynamic of working across global, then US kind of ecosystems. So she's been at SpaceNews for a long time. Many of you read her columns probably daily around regulatory, well, sometimes regulatory issues, but policy and government development and all sorts of things. Sometimes you do other areas within the space industry. So a real expert, and it's such a treat to have you lead this panel today. So we're so grateful to you. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sandra. I'm here like for tech issues. If anyone has a tech issue, you can message me directly in the chat. We're going to encourage you to put questions in the Q&A, and towards the end, we'll try to answer as many as possible. So please keep those coming as you think of questions. So with that, Sandra, take it away.
Thank you so much, Meredith. It's really a pleasure to be moderating this distinguished panel of experts. Again, my name is Sandra Erwin. I'm a reporter with SpaceNews. It's a publication we publish online. We also publish in print. We do a number of newsletters. And as Brian mentioned, I became interested in this topic of foreign businesses trying to come into the US and become US businesses so that they can be integrated into the US industrial base and can do business with the government. It's been a real trend that we're seeing. So before we get into some of these questions, I would like to maybe have each of the panelists introduce themselves and tell us who you are and what is your role in the space economy. Brian, maybe just a brief introduction, and then we'll go around the other panelists.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Brian Holt, recently retired after 20 years in the Air Force and Space Force last July. I've been leading, well, I think most people know me as leading the orbital prime effort for SpaceWorks. Gabe Mounts and I kicked that off back in 2020. And it's been a great, 4 years to watch that play out. But since then, I've joined Exotrail, our parent company's in France, and I've been helping build up the U.S. team and operations here in the U.S., mainly leading the U.S. BD side of our business. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Great. Nate, over to you.
Hey, Nate Notar Giacomo. Like Brian, retired U.S. Air Force. Spent about the last 10 years when I retired at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, where I stood up the IC Space Executive Office, and then we merged that with the National Intelligence Manager for Space. So think about all things policy, strategy, collection, analysis. Everything that had to do with IC Space kind of been through our office in some way, shape, or form. After about 30 years of working with the federal government, I decided that was probably enough, and got offered the opportunity to stand up the U.S. subsidiary of Australia-based TIO. It's been a great journey so far. I'm sure we'll get into it.
Great. Jack Shelton, tell us about you, who you are.
Well, I've probably got the least impressive background among you guys. I'm a lawyer. I got my start in the maritime industry, working for ocean carriers and helping them with a lot of their international deals. That eventually transitioned into doing a lot of export control work. I left a bigger firm that I was working at, decided to start my own shop, and I brought on a partner who had a lot of interest and experience in the space industry, and we decided just to dive headfirst into it. And so that's really where we focus all of our efforts now. We work on export compliance programs. We help foreign companies come to the United States to get involved in SBIRs and other government contracting. And we kind of run the full gamut with licensing, FCC, FAA, NOAA, et cetera, and help companies do all the space things here in the US.
Thank you. And last but not least, Charlie Jacka, tell us about who you are.
Yeah, unfortunately, unlike Nate and Brian, I'm not retired from the Space Force. I will be one day, but I'm a civilian in the Space Force. I've done all types of projects and programs here, from launch to operations to small sats to hybrid space architecture, which is really where I started to get into the international space, really trying to integrate commercial capabilities into the DoD. So looking forward to sharing some of the lessons learned that I have experienced through that process. Currently, I serve as the chief engineer for SpaceWorks, which is a new role. So still learning what that means. I'm happy to take suggestions from the public since I serve you. But yeah, so SpaceWorks, in case you don't know, is one of the premier organizations in the Space Force for helping small businesses innovate with funds, non-dilutive funds. So happy to help and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Charlie.
Yeah.
So I guess maybe one way to start this conversation, given that the title of the webinar is Unlocking Opportunities for Global Companies Entering the U.S. Space and Defense Market, it's important to note that the U.S. space market now is witnessing a surge in participation from foreign firms, and this is driven by market opportunities and the evolving dynamics in the industry. We've seen big players like Airbus, like BAE Systems, giant companies that have been in the US market for a long time, and they are established members of the US industrial base. But what we're seeing now is a new wave of smaller, more specialized companies from all corners of the world, and they're setting their sights on US defense and intelligence work. We have here two representatives from these new space companies. And I would like to maybe start with Brian to give us a sense of what's been the journey for Exotrail becoming a US company. Maybe can you walk us through what the process, where it started and where you are now, and maybe talk about maybe some of the risks and benefits that you've identified along the way?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is just getting the structure right first, and that's really where we focused at Exotrail for the last year. I kind of set our date in sand as the last October, because that's when we were active on SAM.gov. So that was like the benchmark for us at Exotrail. But I think the biggest thing for us was just getting that structure right, and I think Jack will probably get into this a little bit. We started with two subsidiaries. So one was a commercial subsidiary. The second was a federal subsidiary. And the reason for that was we wanted to make sure that we started the government-focused entity, with all the right compliance things in mind. So only US people, ITAR, at the forefront of our compliance thoughts. And then also, building out the IT systems that were separate from the French parent company. So those are the three biggest things that we wanted to do on the federal entity, and on the commercial entity, it wasn't, that we could still, the French were already selling propulsion systems to US customers. They didn't necessarily need an entity in the US to do that. And later as we get into this, I can go into some nuances of that statement. But really what I've focused on for the last year is getting the compliance and regulatory piece built out so we can be successful with the US government. And I think the big takeaway that I would like to communicate here is that there really are no shortcuts in this process. Basically, the parent company and the US company have to be committed to building out this infrastructure to meet the compliance and regulatory requirements from the start, and that there aren't really any shortcuts. And through that lens, it's important to identify what type of company you are. So are you purely more of a supplier that you're going to, try to supply primes or other companies in the US, your products? Because oftentimes you're not going to be, as a supplier, providing the end product to the US government. They're buying capabilities. The good thing about Exotrail is that we are both. So on the propulsion side, we act as a supplier, but then we also are capable of delivering a capability, which is our OTV, to the government. So it's been a very tricky balance, across both these product lines. Again, building out the infrastructure, thinking about FOCI mitigation, and we'll get into that, I'm sure. So I think I just want to pause there and not talk forever, and just say that the first year has really been focused on building the infrastructure to meet the regulatory and compliance structures.
So if we step back from what you said, if you look at a company like Exotrail, you look at the markets, you have to make a corporate decision whether to invest. I mean, this is not a minor investment, it's a significant investment by a company to get into the US market. How do you decide if, of course, everyone knows that the US is the biggest market, the biggest budgets for space and whatnot, but how do you decide that it's a worthwhile pursuit to go along this path?
Yeah, I think from a new space company perspective, especially if I'm looking through the EU lens within Europe, I think most of the companies that start there and are funded by either, European venture or whatever, I think it's almost assumed that you have to go into the US market, not only the commercial market, but possibly think about the defense market. So I don't know if it's more of a decision than a almost an automatic decision or it's more of a necessity. Depending on when the timing is right, I think is the key decision point. And I think for Exotrail, we had just finished our Series B raise, prior to last year. So the capital was there. Obviously, the market exists there, both on the commercial and defense side. So again, the French parent company and our board made the decision to start standing up the U.S. entity. Hired the first few employees, and that's kind of how the decision was made through the Exotrail lens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really interesting story. So I guess maybe I would like to now ask Nate to talk about HEO as, kind of a similar question. Tell us how you established that this was the U.S. market was a good idea to get into, and perhaps, what were some of the roadblocks, or what were some of the questions that came into the minds of the executives at HEO, and maybe can you give us a little history of where the company is now in establishing a U.S. presence?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a different story from Brian's company. HEO is a commercial non-Earth imaging company. So that means we have a fleet of 47 sensors in orbit right now that take resolved images of other stuff in orbit, primarily satellites. So if you all recall, until very recently, that was incredibly heavily regulated here in the US. So there was a couple of PhD students in Sydney that figured out that they could turn satellites and take pictures of other things in low Earth orbit. And then the Australian government said, you can sell that to us for money. They had no idea that was actually a thing. So that's where HEO actually started. So as they started to raise their TRL level, their competency level, they automated their processes. So folks said, look, there's really a market space for this here in the US. So as kind of time went on, they were coming to the US, just they being the founders, and just doing like the conferences and chatting with government people. And it turns out that there was actually a market space for that. And those very innovative folks at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency that said, we're going to take a chance on this foreign company, and we're going to ingest you guys and give you a pathfinder and accelerate you. So as soon as that happened, our poor founders were flying back and forth from Sydney, which is 23 hours one way. And we started identifying additional demand signal from Space Force and industry and civil space. So they decided to drop a full-time flag here. They figured there was enough revenue and opportunities here in the US to take off. So since that time, we've been pretty fortunate. So we are actually a multinational company. We have offices in Sydney, DC, London, and Tokyo. So that means we've got a lot of reach, across those market spaces. But here in the U.S., we actually take advantage of a lot of the ability for our Sydney folks to develop software and to build hardware at a much faster rate, at a much cheaper cost, in a much less regulated environment. And then we just import it here, and then we on-sell it. We add our goodness here, then we on-sell it back to our partners. So the decision to make a full-time U.S. presence was really predicated on the market grew to an unsustainable rate that they couldn't no longer do remotely. And then they needed a couple of people who were very familiar with the US ecosystem and the DoD and the ISD, and then just the federal contracting landscape to kind of bring it to the next level.
So non-Earth imaging, that is a relatively new market. We're hearing a lot more about it. Definitely the Space Force is expected to be a major customer of non-Earth imaging, which is the use of sensors on satellites to take pictures of objects in space. And I guess I understand, you were a key player in the revision of the regulations that took place in 2020 for commercial remote sensing. There was a major overhaul in regulations, and you were involved in that. So can you maybe talk broadly about the role, how these regulations shaped the environment, shaped the commercial environment, and how did companies react in response to that to maybe generate more supply of non-Earth imaging? And is that helping the government now now that it's been a few years since the regulations were changed?
Yeah, so if you don't mind, I'll rewind the script back about 5 or 6 years to where we were under the under the previous administration, the previous White House, and then we were under the previous commercial remote sensing rule. There was basically a consensus that was achieved that the regulatory regime for commercial remote sensing was not serving industry well, and that actually presented 2 problems. First was a national security problem, and the second was a U.S. economic competitive advantage problem. So I worked on the national security part of the problem. What we noticed was that there was some really interesting phenomenologies and capabilities that in 2 cases were invented here in the US, synthetic aperture radar being one of them and non-Earth imaging being the other, that we actually ceded to foreigners, Finland for SAR and fortunately for me, Australia for non-Earth imaging, because we just could not, they were so heavily regulated that we could not close business cases here. So that presented our, and so if we're allowing that to happen overseas, we have very limited access to that from a national security standpoint, and we have a very limited access to kind of, you know, when we need it in times of crisis, it's not as seamless as it possibly should be. So the other part, ceding a lot of the global space economy to our foreign competitors, and that was just nonsense. So there was a decision that was made to do 2 things, and one of them, Sandra, that you kind of mentioned, it led to these smaller companies coming to the US. There was a deliberate push by the Department of Commerce over that time period to go out and actively recruit folks to come here to the US and make the US the flag of choice for these foreign companies. So, you know, come here, enjoy our space ecosystem, bring high-paying tech jobs, bring this new technology, and then flourish in an ecosystem that is, you know, we got great amounts of capital to take advantage of. We've got great manufacturing capacities. We've got a great workforce here. So drop flags here. Some of that had to do with, we had to get some policy challenges taken care of, and we had to get some regulatory challenges taken care of. And once that started, you know, changing, we started seeing this influx, which is what you're seeing now with all these folks like Exotrail and NTO coming here. So what has changed? So folks like me have a job because in about the 2020 timeframe, we realized that we could no longer hobble U.S. commercial remote sensing companies to the detriment. We could no longer hold them to such a degree of accountability that foreigners could just walk right past them in the competitive landscape. So, you know, when you saw the synthetic aperture radar things roll off, we saw companies like Capella and Umbra and others start to be able to flourish here, and HEO as well. So now what I tell people is when we saw the war in Ukraine first kick off, the first companies to go over there were those synthetic aperture radar companies to start providing data stream to the Ukrainians. That never would have happened pre-2020. For non-Earth imaging, kind of getting back to the point, that was a very, very closely held capability that was only, and I can't even really talk about it, and Brian knows exactly what I'm talking about. It was held behind so many doors that nobody ever saw it. Only a very, very small handful of people have ever saw it. So when HEO came on the scene, they cracked the nut at how to use a whole bunch of sensors and cobble them together through automation and literally using AI and ML to where you click a button and our algorithm takes over and you're tasking non-Earth imagery. So we do it literally at scale on industrial scale. So this data stream has never been available before. And a lot of times what we do is we educate people on what that data stream looks like, the metadata that's in it, some of the unique and innovative ways that you can decipher some of the things that we bring back. And it is probably on a monthly basis where I'll have a government or industry person come back to me and say, you know, we could really use this product in X way. And it's unlocking all kinds of new things. So we just talked with one of our partners who could not figure out how to look at, you know, where satellites are pointing because they didn't have enough data on modeling. We have nothing but data on modeling, so they can start getting those error ellipses way down to kilometers instead of hundreds of kilometers. But like I said, it's really kind of so nascent that we every month or so we're developing new applications for it. And I'll break there.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Nate. I think maybe this would be a good time to bring up this question from one of our audience members, and maybe Nate, you can answer. You know, obviously we all know that, you know, the US has the largest space industry, the biggest government budget, but as far as, you know, the benefits of a US company, of an international company coming in and trying to compete with the entrenched prime contractors, which you do see in non-Earth imaging and other sectors as well. What is the incentive to do that? Can you really fight these big primes? Can you really compete on a level playing field?
So that's been my year. So there's two things there, right? So the primes don't want to be unseated, but in my specific case, the primes don't have the capability that we have because we are the world leader in this, according to the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency anyway. So they can do one of two things. They can spend, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars out of their own pockets to develop their own capability. And I think they'll find out that we actually have most of the market locked up as far as on-orbit available sensors. Or they can just, partner with us and do like a prime sub relationship. So what we've done is instead of fighting with them, we've actually made a concerted effort to actually partner with them. And the reception has been really, really good. And we've actually told folks in the Space Force and the intelligence community, look, we understand it's really, really difficult to kick out a sole source prime contract. But if you guys already have hundreds of millions of dollars on a prime contract, we're happy to slide in as a sub and provide you data through one of your primes. And that's done a couple of things. That's opened up these giant IDIQs to us in an innovative way. The government does not have to provide us with, with their own contract. And it actually kind of mitigates some of their concerns about us being a foreign company. So essentially, they're kind of stepping it back one to the prime and letting our data and our foreignness kind of trickle through them.
Yeah, I just want to add there real quick. I agree with Nate what you said. I think as new companies come into the U.S., the key with the primes is one, identifying your niche. So, what value can you add to the primes versus trying to compete directly with them? And then subbing to them is a great first, approach for the first year or two. And the reason why is the big risk is, past performance is king in evaluation of contracts. And if it's your first year or two, working your products into the U.S. and you don't want to trip across the line and have some negative past performance characteristics, on your company. So I think starting small with the primes, partnering with them, and building those relationships very, very step by step is the right approach.
So to that point just made by Brian and Nate about partnering and working with primes, maybe I want to bring in Charlie because SpaceWorks runs a big program, the space or the Small Business Innovation Research Technology Innovation and now technology sharing, STTR, which requires only US companies to be prime contractors. So Charlie, can you talk about what do you tell foreign companies that want to participate, that want to sign up for these SBIR SpaceWorks challenges, but they face the regulatory restrictions? What would be some advice, and how do they navigate that process?
Yeah, so you hit the nail on the head. Unfortunately, right now, because policy, our small business innovative funds can only go to US companies. That being said, we're looking at opportunities for other funding sources to create a SBIR-like program for to be inclusive of foreign companies. I will say some of the other programming that SpaceWorks does, such as our accelerators and our like Catalyst Campus, they do allow foreign companies in TAP labs. So like we have other entry points where maybe if you have you have an idea or a product, maybe it's less funding, or maybe we're paying for data, it's maybe a little less, SBIRs usually focuses on tech dev and non-dilutive funding for that, but we have other programs. I guess what I'm saying is we have other programs that allow foreign entities to enter into the US market while we try to figure out the policy part of being more inclusive with our foreign partners.
Thank you, Charlie. When do you expect that we're going to hear more details about potentially this new SBIR initiative?
Hopefully soon. Yeah, policy is not quick, so we're working that, and we'll see. Hopefully the new administration will also be supportive of this effort, right? So, but we're hopeful that it's soon. We are working even government to government. So, what are some collaborative programming we can do between the US and other foreign governments where we can bolster through their foreign governments, their investment in their small companies. So there's a bunch of opportunity space, and we're just trying to navigate it and see what the right fit is. And
yeah,
low hanging fruit, right? Where can we go, and where should we go first?
yeah, that would be a huge shakeup in the SBIR community if some of these changes were made to bring in more foreign firms. So we'll see how that goes. So before we get into more questions on the specific initiatives that y'all are working on, but Jack, I wanted to bring you in and maybe try to explain to the audience maybe this FOCI mitigation. Is that something that your clients come to you and it's like, break it down, what is involved and how long does it take to go through this process? And is it realistic for maybe small businesses that don't have a lot of money or resources to try to embark on this, or is it only accessible to large companies with more resources? What is sort of the environment that you're seeing right now with companies trying to go through FOCI mitigation?
Sure. So generally, I would say it's not nearly as hard as people think it is.
And please explain what FOCI mitigation is before.
Sure. Yeah. So just to start with, the SBIR and STTR programs, SBIR and STTR programs, they both require that there be a U.S. company who is contracting with the government, and that company has to have more than 50% U.S. ownership and control, right? And so you don't want to just set up a foreign subsidiary of a foreign company in the United States that's 100% owned by the foreign company. That would be ineligible. So you have companies, what they'll do is they'll set up a company in the United States, and then they have to figure out, okay, we have to give more than 50% of this company away to an American person. And that, of course, comes with a lot of heartburn. Often what they'll do is they will initially have, let's say, an American salesperson in the United States who's leading the sales effort. And they might tap that person and say, hey, can you be our majority owner in the United States? But then, of course, they say, well, we trust this person to an extent, but do we want this person to have more than 50% control over our company? Do we want this person to obtain the majority of our company profits? That freaks them out. And of course, they're foreign investors who are investing in their foreign company thinking, why does this random American person have 50% of our American company? And so what we do is we put some structures in place to make sure that that American person can't just run away with the company. We do something similar to what Brian talked about, where you actually have two different companies. We typically set up one company as essentially a special purpose vehicle for entering into SBIR and STTR contracts. We limit the ability of that company to do certain things. So the American person is still in control of the company, but we'll have restrictions in the foundational documents of the company saying, hey, this company can only be used for SBIR and STTR contracts unless all of the shareholders agree. And so we can put certain minority shareholder protections in place. We can do certain other things to make sure that that American person, as much as you might love and trust them, can't just go crazy one day and just take over the company and run wild. And then, of course, you'll have the other company in the United States that is more of the commercial company that doesn't have all of those restrictions, which might be 100% owned by the foreign firm that can be involved in all sorts of commercial contracts and other non-SBIR STTR opportunities. So it's not crazy hard. We've actually done it with a lot of companies. So we have a structure that we like, that we're able to replicate to a certain degree. And the setting up the structure itself isn't that hard. We have more difficulty often just getting people through the process of registering in SAM and a lot of these ministerial things that people have to do.
And FOCI is an acronym for what exactly?
Oh, yes. So FOCI is an acronym for Foreign Ownership, Control, and Influence. And I believe it was the 2022 Defense the SBIR reauthorization bill. I think that's what it was called. Basically, the government said, hey, we've got a lot of foreign companies getting involved in SBIRs, and we need to actually start asking questions. So they included, if you look at the SBIR policy directive, they included all of essentially a questionnaire that the government has to pose to new applicants saying, hey, tell us a little bit about your foreign ownership, any foreign affiliations you have, etc. So when you apply for a SBIR, you have to certify that you meet the requirements, that you're more than 50% US owned and controlled. And for a while, it's just been this self-certification. Now there's actually a questionnaire involved where the government's actually asking some questions. And so you need to make sure that in all of your corporate documents, you don't have, you're not just setting up a sham structure, right? Because it's easy to set up something on paper that is completely different from what you're doing in practice. And the government can ask for your corporate documents and all of your contracts, et cetera. And if you actually have a structure in place that in reality isn't the same thing as what you're telling the government it is, they can find out and you can, get in some trouble there.
What are the issues associated with manufacturing? Because like some of the SBIR projects that SpaceWorks funds are mostly research and development, prototyping. Some other space and defense contracts that are now we're seeing from the Department of Defense are for like large scale manufacturing. For example, the Space Development Agency, they're asking for dozens of satellites, and they want to make sure that the company has a US-based manufacturing base. At what point does a company have to build a factory and put all the equipment and machinery in place and have a production line that replicates what they have overseas? Do they actually have to do that to be accepted in a manufacturing contract, for example?
Well, if we're thinking in the SBIR context, we start with a phase one, which is really primarily research, R&D, and phase two, you might get into prototyping, and then you get into phase three, and maybe that's when you start getting into commercialization and actually building things out. The SBIR program does require that all the work must be done in the United States, and that gets a little tricky. Some of the work can be subcontracted out. There's a certain percentage based on whether it's a SBIR contract or a STTR contract, STTR, where you're working with the university. Those percentages change a little bit. But it might be 30% or 50% you might be able to sub out to other American companies, but you can't sub it out of the United States. There is one little carve out that says in certain unique circumstances, if, let's say, certain components aren't available in the United States, you can ask the contracting officer for permission for you to procure something overseas. But that's supposed to be unique, rare circumstances. Really, all the work's supposed to be done here.
Maybe you can address this question, another question from the audience, as far as, are there specific restrictions that international companies should keep in mind when coming to the US market? For example, by virtue of being in the US market, does that imply restrictions on doing business elsewhere in the world? That's a good question. Can you maybe address that?
I could speak for a couple of hours on this one. So first issue you're going to have is export compliance. So to the extent you're actually developing new technology in the United States, that technology is going to have US jurisdiction all over it. So whether it's ITAR or EAR, depending on the classification of your thing, you've developed it here, US is going to have jurisdiction over it. So some companies, what they'll do is they'll have their foreign company and their US company, and they might in parallel be developing the same kind of item, the same kind of hardware, same kind of technology, and they're just not sharing the American development over with their French team, let's say. And so they can say, hey, the phrase that people like to use is ITAR free. It's not a very precise phrase, but that's what they'll use for their foreign made stuff. And so they'll say, okay, this widget we developed in the United States for the US market, this widget we developed in France for the international market, the widget we developed in France, we can export that all over the place, just according to French and EU export compliance. The American product, we need to now worry about export compliance for it. So there's that aspect. The next aspect is, okay, you've got a foreign company and a US company. If the foreign company is not owned by the US company, the foreign company isn't going to have to worry so much about American sanctions, et cetera. But the American company will. The American company is going to have to worry about not only export controls, but sanctions as well. There's certain countries we just can't do business with. There are lists of entities and individuals that we can't do business with, et cetera. If the foreign company is owned by the US company, they might also have some of those restrictions on them as well. So that's something that we would also need to think about in terms of the structure. Which company is going to be the parent and which company is going to be the sub?
Mm-hmm. What about investments? What about foreign investments? How does the US identify, well, this company gets Chinese investors, so we don't want to work with them? At what stage does that come up?
There's a couple stages. So the first stage is if you have an American company and it receives a foreign investment, we have to worry about something called CFIUS. This is the Committee on Foreign Investments in the United States. CFIUS, if they have jurisdiction, and they don't always, but if they have jurisdiction over a certain transaction, they can either prevent the transaction from happening, or if they find out about it after the fact, they can force the transaction to be unwound. And then they can put a national security agreement in place. They can force you to have a third-party monitor. They can do all of this draconian stuff, which just eats all of your operating budget away and really hurts you a whole lot. And we've seen that happen in the space industry a couple times. So CFIUS has jurisdiction only in a couple of instances. Without getting way down into the details, there's essentially two different tests that they have. One is if you have something called a covered control transaction, where the investor could potentially have a level of control over the company. Now, that doesn't mean that they've got a majority interest in it. It could be what they call a dominant minority interest, or they could get control through board seats, et cetera. And you also have something called a covered transaction, again, which there's different factors that play into that. It's a covered investment. I think I got that word wrong there. So with a covered investment, there's a few different factors, but those also include things like, do you have a board seat? Can the foreign investor have access to material non-public information? Things like this. So we always want to structure the investments, if we can, to not meet one of those tests. Very often what we'll do is we'll say, okay, foreign investment is going to be limited to, let's say, 10% or less of equity, and there's not going to be a board seat. Or if there is a board seat, we want to make sure that certain other little exclusions in the rules apply, so that we don't have to have a mandatory disclosure, a declaration or anything. So once we determine that CFIUS actually has jurisdiction, then there may or may not be a requirement to actually tell CFIUS on the front end about the transaction before you go through with it. If you've got that requirement and you don't tell the government, you can be hit with massive penalties. But then even if the government doesn't require the declaration, it still might be a really smart idea to tell the government anyway. Because if you tell CFIUS about your transaction, they could greenlight it, and then they won't have the ability to come back later and tank your transaction later. That's important because, you know, in this round, you might not need to tell CFIUS, but you might have a future round where you do, and then CFIUS is going to look back at all of the current investors. They're going to see foreign investors, and then they're going to review all of that anyway. So it might just be smart to go ahead and get a green light from the government in the beginning. The second issue you run into is if you're actually trying to put things in orbit, the FAA does a national security review, and they review the rocket and who owns the space launch company, and they also review all of the payloads and who owns the payloads. And you know, we've seen some issues in the news over the last couple of years of at least one company getting in, having an issue when trying to put a payload on a rocket, and CFIUS saying, "Hey, we don't like your ownership. We see you've got a Russian founder. You're going to have to remove that Russian founder if you ever want to go in orbit." And potentially that could also happen if there are certain later investors who the government really doesn't like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm familiar with that launch story. we covered it in the news a lot for quite a long time. It's really interesting. Maybe Charlie, maybe you know, as someone who works with government, you partner with other government organizations. I know you work with like the Defense Innovation Unit. Now we have the Office of Strategic Capital. You know, these and AFWorks, you know, you all are trying to help the industrial base compete in the global environment. And to what extent are you looking at some of these issues that Jack just talked about foreign investors potentially trying to get into American companies? And to what extent do you see that as an issue that you look at when you decide where to put your money?
So part of the SBIR policy is actually we have to do a review of each applicant to see what foreign investments or foreign personnel or ownership is a part of that company. And so each company, for each proposal that comes through the process, we do a complete review on. And we do sometimes have to decline making or providing funds to a company because of those ownerships and relationships. So it's early. As Jack mentioned, it's like we can start as early as phase 1 doing this review. And so it's something you should be constantly thinking about, that if you want to have access to these US government funds, that we will be considering that as we potentially look at funding the company, right? And so make smart decisions early, but I would say.
Yeah. I mean, do you see a lot of companies get rejected?
I can't give exact numbers, but it does happen, right? So it's something to be aware of. Yeah.
So another question, and I don't know, maybe this was for Jack. How important is it for alliances like NATO that international companies consider a legal entity in the US? I mean, is there a direct connection between the space economy and the national security side of space?
I'm not quite sure I understood the question. So in terms of just setting up an entity in the United States.
Yeah, I guess, does that help
Yeah.
international relations? I guess the obvious answer would be yes, but.
Well, I mean, to the extent that you're going to need to get involved in certain contracts, you're definitely going to need a US entity. You know, I've also talked to foreign companies that are getting involved in the US, and they're not necessarily immediately going after a contract. They want to come to the US just to get involved in sales and build relationships. And one of the things that they've noticed is, well, people hear their accents and say, wait, are you a foreign company? Can we be talking to you? And not everybody is that familiar with export control rules and everything, and they sometimes get a little fidgety. And so, you know, our strategy was, well, okay, if you're going to be coming to the US a lot and dealing with US companies, even though you don't necessarily need a US company, let's just spin up an LLC because it's easy. And then you can say, yes, we have an American company. And then we can put a roadmap together of, okay, we don't need to do this right now, but let's go ahead and put a roadmap together where you can start applying for your green card, so that eventually you will be a US person and you get treated just like a citizen when it comes to export compliance. But just having the US entity from an optics perspective is really helpful for those foreign companies who just want to build relationships here.
Mm-hmm. By the way, getting very good feedback from the audience on your explanation. So thank you for educating us on a lot of these very complex issues, Jack. As a follow-up question, how long would it take to set up a US entity if somebody came to you, to your firm, and lay out a plan? What is the timeline?
I hate to say it depends, but
yeah,
it depends. I mean, we've been able to spin up companies really fast. Like if we needed to get something done in a day, hypothetically, we could get something done in a day. I seem to rarely have that much free time on my schedule where I can drop everything and get that done that fast, though. And if I were to take precedent documents and just hand them over to a company, they would have a lot of, well, what does this mean? We're sure we don't want to tweak a couple things. So there's always going to be back and forth, and so that timeline always gets extended based on the clients themselves wanting to change things about the structure. And so, what could be very fast might turn into 6 months. Often also, it's not just the creation of the structure that is an issue. It's all of the other little ministerial things. It's getting the bank account set up, applying in SAM. SAM registration is actually very obnoxious. The first thing you have to do is have an EIN, a tax ID number, and you have to give the IRS your address. Okay, well, what happens if you don't have a brick and mortar facility? Okay, you're going to try to use something like Regis, one of these companies that does virtual offices. SAM, the folks at SAM don't like virtual offices. So now what you're going to need to do is go to Regis and say, okay, I need an actual office with a door that closes, and I need you to give me an actual lease. And then you can show that to the folks at SAM. If you end up having to change your address, and your address is different in SAM versus the IRS, that's a problem for SAM. If there's a difference in the suite number or the office number, they freak out about that. So then you have to change your address with the IRS. And when you call the IRS asking them to change the address, they just hang up on you. And that's a process, unbelievably, that sometimes takes months. That's one of the biggest problems that we've had, is getting the IRS to change a dang address. So it's a lot of these little ministerial things that become the problem, not what you would think is the really hard work of structuring a company.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's super helpful for a lot of people that are just getting into this, Jack. So I'm sure you're going to get a lot of calls after this. But I wanted to, before we run out of time, I wanted to maybe get Nate back in the conversation about remote sensing, because that is such a growing area where there's more international involvement and innovation happening. I was wondering if you can talk about maybe what do you make of the National Reconnaissance Office now being more open to working with foreign companies. They've been putting out BAAs or broad area announcements that are open to foreign companies. What do you make of that change? And is it having an impact in the industry, do you think? I mean, maybe speaking for here or in general, based on conversations maybe you've had with colleagues.
Yeah, that's a sea change for NRO, and I really applaud it. I mean, that took a lot of just, a lot of honestly courage for the folks at NRO to go, we got to think beyond what we've done traditionally. And I think that's a real recognition that over the past few years, I mean, like it or not, some of the world-class capabilities are not being developed here in the US. And as a former warfighter, I can tell you, with very few exceptions, I really didn't care where my equipment or my information came from. I just wanted it to be the best in the world, because the bad guy needs to just go away. And if he has it because of a restriction, a Buy American restriction, that's not going to make me happy. So I think we've seen a lot of that needle move, especially in the intelligence community over the past few years. And I applaud it. Now, as somebody who has had a lot of discussions with the NRO team on being a foreign company and potentially actually applying for some of these BAs that come out, I'll tell you, they've thought it through, and they definitely are still putting up some protections. Like for us, we cannot sell data that does not come off of a US NOAA licensed payload. They will not take something from before. And you know what? I'm fine with that. And that's just from my standpoint. But yeah, I definitely will applaud it. And again, I think it's just a recognition that there are some really, really world-leading capabilities that we just have not been able to onshore here in the US, and they want to take advantage of it.
Yeah. That's been a really interesting trend. Another agency that maybe I wanted to ask, I don't know, maybe Brian, you can talk about, supply chain issues that we're seeing in the US space industry. There's been some very well-documented problems getting components, sub-tier pieces of equipment for satellites, for space vehicles. To what extent do you think maybe that there has to be some type of maybe regulatory change or policy change, so the U.S. satellite manufacturers, for example, can leverage sub-tier suppliers from overseas. And speaking as a propulsion supplier, propulsion is a good example of that. I mean, there's a big shortage. What are some areas that you think could be dealt with better?
I think most of the areas I've seen are just on the contract level. So at like SDA, for example, on their tranches, not as industry, we don't get to see what those requirements are and how far down in the supply chain those requirements are pushed. Obviously, the primes and the program managers see that, but having better insights or communications and opening up like those requirements would be helpful to industry, because I don't think the transparency or visibility is really there today around that. So, and you're exactly right. So, SDA on the tranches is facing issues with they need more propulsion providers. They've had failures. There's propulsion companies that are going out of business, and there's a global market out there that can help fill these requirements. And it's exactly what Nate was saying through that use case. So I think, and this is one of my main points I kind of wanted to get across before we ended today, is that we just need the U.S. defense system needs more pathways to bring more depth and breadth to our technology basket. So we need to be able to pick from other sources when we need it. The NRO's taken some steps. Ironically, the IC is leading, I think, a little bit more than what we're seeing on the DoD side. I think NATO is starting to show a shift here. They've stood up an effort that's called SpaceNet. There's the Diana program. And I think what Charlie and the SpaceWorks team is hopefully doing is, I think, SpaceWorks, DIU, these innovation arms have to connect externally to NATO and, bring in the SSCIA teams. That there's just a kind of a whole approach here that has to be led from the top of the Space Force and the DoD. And I think we've seen small little signals here and there, but we're not seeing the momentum that I think is required to solve our shortfalls in the supply chain. So hopefully that answered the question.
Charlie, any reaction to that? Do you see more pathways, to use Brian's word, more pathways being made available?
That's the end goal, right? I think you see, I like to say, centers of excellence where people are niching out and being able to work with international. And so it's really about how can we amplify those wins? How can we extrapolate those further, reach further? And like Brian alluded to, how do we as an innovation community work better to create a full pipeline so that you all can transition into program records in the end, right? So we're working it.
Excellent, excellent. So unfortunately, we've reached the end of our time. This was really a fascinating discussion. I really would like to thank our panelists for your insights and educating us on all these important issues. So thank you so much. And now we'll turn it over to Meredith for any closing remarks.
This was such an interesting conversation. I mean, the depth that we were able to get into is just really powerful. So thank you all so much for participating in this conversation. And all of our panelists you can find on LinkedIn, so you can connect with them that way if you have follow-up questions that we weren't able to get to. And we're just so grateful. You all know that Hyperspace Challenge is really about finding ways to support commercial and government interaction and to really further the community and build the community so that we can have the innovation that our warfighters need, that the commercial side needs. And so you all are a part of that, and the people who listen to this and take notes away from this are part of that, and we're grateful to each and every one of you. And with that, we'll wrap, and feel free to reach out to anyone on the panel or to reach out to Hyperspace Challenge if you have any questions at all. And see you next month for Hyperspace Challenge's Friendsgiving, and December in person. If you're in Albuquerque, we'll see you December 6th. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And in particular, thank you so much to our panelists for such a great conversation.
Thank
you.
Thanks,
Have a
everybody.
great day.
All right.
Take care.